tonight, in all truthfulness, we are going to talk about drift fishing. And it's funny, every time nowadays you mention drift fishing, folks go, oh yeah, you're flossing, or you're just, yeah, you're dragging long leaders or whatever it is. That is not typically the history of drift fishing. So it all started out drift fishing, believe it or not. If you were a bank fisherman back in the day, you were a drift fisherman, and we're talking leaders of 18 to 30 inches typically is what we're talking about. And I'm going to walk through a number of different presentations here that you can, or offerings that you can present out there as you're drift fishing with your weight, believe it or not, actually ticking along the bottom. And we're not talking about a bunch of weight that is, you know, you're throwing out there on the bottom of the river and it's starting and stopping where you got to lift your rod and get it to move and drift on through the hole. We're not talking about that. We're also not talking about using enough weight that your rod tip is constantly just bouncing like crazy, okay? We're talking about matching current speed in water that's conducive to holding steelhead, that is actually going through at natural current speed. And if you're doing it right, and we're going to show you how to do that tonight, your lead is basically tapping bottom about every 3 feet or so, about every yard. You're just coming in contact with bottom, keeping your presentation down in the strike zone. So when we talk about drift fishing, I'm going to break down these rods and show you different riggings on them. We're going to talk about different weight options that you have to figure out exactly what type or how to present your weight. But at the end of it, this is considered terminal gear, okay? You basically are offering them something that if everything goes right in this hatchery fish, it's a terminal day, so it's terminal gear. We have a number of things that we can use on this board that you can drift fish. And everything on this board that you can drift fish, you can also bobber dog. So for all you folks that are so happy with your results and how easy bobber dogging is, it actually all started with drift fishing. Back in the day, we would drift fish all this stuff long before you ever took a float stuck at 8 feet or 10 feet above this particular presentation, and it was just drifting through the drift. So if we look over here to my left, starting off, one of the old tried and trues, the YBC Spin and Glow, been around forever. Oftentimes back in the day, if I was drift fishing with Spin and Glow, I'd run a double hook setup because I'm putting a sand shrimp on there, which is a great offering for steelhead, okay? And as we let that work through the water, that's just, the lead is dragging. And as you can see on this board, most of these are all rigged with stick leads because anymore, if I'm drift fishing, that's pretty much all I'm using. I'm going to walk through different leads in a little bit, but for me, it's all about the stick lead, drift fishing, matching the current speed, and presenting an offering that moves along naturally, one that doesn't constantly start and stop. Spinning glows have been used for years. Corkies is something I grew up on. A lot of folks have a chest drawer of Corkies. Here's a lot of the old ones that I have from back in the day, all various colors, all different sizes. Simply, believe it or not, back in the day, you could get steelhead on something as simple as a size 10 or 12 little Corky. This pink pearl and that sunrise combination back in the day would get it done with a single hook. No bait, no scent, no nothing. No, you're not flossing because, again, you're using about a 20-inch leader in a single Corky. And yes, fish will bite those. It's no different than nowadays when they will go after a bead. So just a different type of buoyancy, a different type of feel for them. Obviously, this is a hard surface that they would bite on. But steelhead are driven by color and color contrast for sure. And back in the day in clear water, some of these colors were hard to beat. If there was a steelhead in there, believe it or not, it wouldn't take much. If you were first line to pass through the water, a simple little Corky, a hook, and you were in business. So Corkies worked forever. They still do. They haven't gone away. You can still use them. Whether you end up setting up a double rig or fish that single. As we progress, soft plastics become pretty prevalent nowadays. You know, egg clusters that look like our old Okie drifters have become pretty popular. There's a number of manufacturers out there making soft egg clusters. You can pin those up just like you would a bead. It's a soft plastic. It's neutral buoyant. You put a hook on there. It typically, depending on size of hook, I typically couple these, if you can find them, with a size 3, believe it or not, is a great size hook to run with a soft plastic. Down here I got one of the new B&R soft beads. You know, bead fishing has become all the craze. You can actually drift fish beads and they do very well. All different sizes. B&R for me is one of the go-tos. Obviously, they have so many options, different colors. These pearl these multicolor ones that look like that faded out, bleached out egg that is just kind of tumbling along down the river, oranges and peaches, some of them with white accents. These all work based on water conditions. And typically a single bead of various sizes, depending on water clarity and depth, is going to get it done. Yes, they drift fish very well. A lot of folks fish them under bobbers, either bobber dogging or suspended under a float. But drift fishing works great. Believe it or not, you can also drift fish with soft plastic worms. Put that with a corky. Again, I use this setup a lot bobber dogging, but you know what? It works very well when I'm simply drift fishing. You can drift fish soft plastics. Now, one of the go-tos for years is making homemade rags. This one's a little on the large side. I use that puffier yarn. After it gets wet, I typically trim these down a little bit depending on water clarity. So I always like to make them a little bigger just in the event I'm fishing waters that are with minimal clarity. I have a nice big profile that's going to get them. Typically match that up with some egg or some shrimp in the bait loop there. Okay, going to cinch that up, pull that down. This is just made out of backer rod and multicolors of yarn. The reasons for multicolors, 2 or 3 multicolors on your rags, is because of contrast. Again, Steelhead key in on color contrast, so I want to make sure I give them a lot of colors to choose from. A little diversion from that, but still kind of the same idea, is just simply a yarny, multicolor yarny ball. They're somewhat buoyant, but you can fish those with a size 1 or a size 1/0 hook is going to do very well. These yarnies are great. They're very inexpensive to make. And by drift fishing those, they work fantastic. Now, one thing you can do when it comes to yarn, no matter if it's on a rag or a yarn ball, is by adding some of your oils. I typically use Mike's. I think it's the best in the market because of how natural they smell and how well they work. But anytime I add oil, an oil-based product to any of your yarns, and it absorbs it, not only does it add scent, it adds a tremendous amount of scent, but it also adds buoyancy. You'd be amazed at how much higher this yarn ball will float in the water column simply by adding some oil to it. So you have scent and you have additional buoyancy with your yarnies. If you're not adding scent to your yarnies, you need to start doing that. It gives them something else to key in on. You draw them with the color, they have a little scent, and again, it adds increased buoyancy. Now, one of the old standbys that we've used for years, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s fishing, is the old Okie drifter. My buddy Herzog for years was reintroducing the old theory of the Okie drifter, the original ones back in the day. That's what these are. These seldom get fished because I just want to hold on to them because they're not very easy to find. But in fact, going back to it, the Okie drifter is one that's been around for years. Back in the day, much like the corky, you could simply fish a single Okie drifter, a size 1 or 1/0 hook, and Steelhead would absolutely go after those things. And, you know, for all intents and purposes, still do today because it's been tried and true. It's something that works. Any and all of these will work because they are buoyant or neutral buoyant. Some of them have action. They have color. They have contrast. They're exactly what you want to utilize for drift fishing. So how do we get there? What is drift fishing all about? Set this down real quick. Okay, so a lot of it starts with our lead options. Okay, now for me, here is a typical drift fishing setup. I like to use a bait casting setup. I typically, from fishing the bank, I'll run a 9 to 9.5 foot rod. As you can see on here, I have a rag lure, and of course I have my stick lead. I have about a 20-inch leader. I have my main line, which, because I also use this rod for bobber fishing, I have a top shot of 20-pound monofilament tied onto my braid. Now, for years I advocated, hey, don't use braid for drift fishing. If you get hung up, you leave a lot of braid in the river. I would say that to folks that tie their braid directly to their swivel at the terminal end of their tackle. If you put on about 12 or 18 foot of monofilament top shot, you have a very small section in there with stretch capability. You also have a break-off portion of your line that if it does get wrapped up into something, you have to snap that off. If you're going to leave anything in the river, it's going to be that monofilament and not the braid, which is better for the environment. So you can use braid for drift fishing, and I actually advocate that you do because it telegraphs so much better as you go through your drift. You can feel that weight touching the bottom every so often, which is exactly what you're striving for. So put that top shot on there. Run your stick lead or whatever weight choice we're going to run through here that you can choose from. You know, again, 18 to 36 inch leader. That's going to depend on the buoyancy of your presentation and the clarity of your water, okay? If you have a really buoyant lure like a rag and I run a 36-inch leader, depending on the current I'm fishing in, that thing may float up well out of the strike zone of the fish that I'm targeting. If the water's not that high and the current's not that fast and I got a pretty buoyant lure, I may want to shorten that leader down to about an 18 to 20 inch leader, which is only going to allow it to rise so high in the water column, keeping it in the strike zone of where the fish are at. I'm going to add my scent to that rag. I'm going to run that 1 or size 1/0 hook, and that's going to get it done as I drift fish that through the water column. Now, when you're drift fishing, here's the key to drift fishing. I'm looking out at the water and it's moving from my right to my left. I'm going to cast upriver at about a 45-degree angle. The current's going to start carrying that presentation back towards me to where it's going to at some point be straight out in front of me. As it is dropping, it begins to contact bottom about every yard or so. As that line comes sweeping through, I collect my slack in the line so I can feel that rod tip just following the bottom contour, okay? Now when I begin to put that presentation out there, I don't cast all the way across the river. I need to fish the near water to my side first. So I'm going to throw it out upriver on the inside. You'll see where that current seam is breaking out there. And that soft water on the inside of that current seam is a very good starting point of where fish like to hold. I'm going to toss that out there, let it drift through, collect my slack, come, and I'm going to follow the rod tip down river with my line. I'm going to follow my line down river. Now the biggest mistake a lot of folks make when they first start drift fishing is they'll get about 2/3 of the way through their drift. It'll drop off the inside of the current, and next thing you know, they start reeling in. And that's the biggest mistake you can make, because a lot of times as that drops in off of the current, it will lie there for a second. That's where fish are going to come over and pick it up. So you don't necessarily want to reel that in too quickly. You want to allow that to come off of the current edge, sit for just a little bit, see if a fish doesn't pick it up at the end of the drift and start giving you something to feel. Now you're going to repeat that. You're going to cast out a little further. You're going to let it swing through the drift. Again, it's going to break past the current. It's going to slow down and just kind of stop, settle in that soft water, leave it sit. You've casted further. It actually pendulums downriver a few feet further than your previous cast. You're going to cast mid-river, okay? You're going to only cast out to the water that's moving fast as maybe that you would like to walk, is what they usually reference. If it's really raging on the other side, don't even waste your time. Don't need to throw it over there. First of all, it's not going to get down to bottom because it's moving too fast with your weight. Secondly, as it gets to the tail end, it's just going to pendulum up and come out of the strike zone. So you got to kind of pick your battle. So work that stretch of water from inside to out. Take steps 10, 15 feet downriver, repeat the process. 45 up, let it swing through, let it drop off the inside of the current seam, let it sit, let those fish come and pick it up, let them come to you, and when you feel that fish pick it up and start bouncing your rod tip, you need to set the hook pretty darn aggressively. It's not like we have a float that they can take down that you can see. It's not like they're just picking it up and swimming along with it. You need to feel that fish, you need to reel down, get the slack out of the line, and give them a good pop, really bury that hook, okay? That's a typical drift fishing setup. Again, I like a 9.5 foot rod. 6 to 15 for me gets it done all day long. One of my favorite line weights of rods to fish steelhead. So, some other options we have. Now, if you are in a drift boat or a sled and you're fishing with a guide or somebody is talking to you about how to present this offering 45 degrees out the back of the boat, this is side drifting. Side drifting is not to be confused with drift fishing. Side drifting typically employs about a 6, 7, sometimes 8 foot leader. Oftentimes they run a little dual hook setup with a small cheater or something. You put some bait in the bait loop. I have a single piece of lead out there. I'm actually going to cast this. Now the biggest difference here is I'm not standing idle on the bank. I'm in a boat that's moving. So as I throw this at a 45 behind us and we're moving down river, we're literally just dragging this down through the holes. We're just letting that lead tap every so often. It's a technique. It's a method. It's, for whatever reason, there's many that are convinced that a longer leader for side drifting works better. I've spent years side drifting with 3-foot leaders and have caught plenty of fish. I have never bought into the theory that we need 6-foot leaders. I have fished them with other folks in boats, and I'm okay, that's what we're doing, great. I think you can side drift and do just fine with 3-foot leaders, but what do I know? So side drifting is a different technique. It's not to be confused with drift fishing. Now, that being said, side drifting is not what you're doing if you're standing on the bank fishing a 6 or 8 foot leader. You are flossing. There's a difference, right, Bo? So there is drift fishing, which we're talking about tonight. There is side drifting, which is a technique that's been used in Washington State and in the Northwest for years. Very productive when in a boat moving with the current, matching current speed, dragging multiple baits and presentations through the hole, longer leader, whatever. That is side drifting. If you're standing at the bank and you're casting out 6 and 8 foot leaders with a small little cheater or floaty device and an oversized hook or a little piece of yarn and a hook, you are flossing. You are not drift fishing. If you have anything longer than a 30-inch leader, 36-inch leader for whatever reason, and you're fishing the bank, you are not drift fishing, you are flossing. I just want to be clear on that. So it's a technique that's proven, and if that's how you fish, great. I'm just trying to dispel the rumors and the misinformation, the difference between drift fishing, side drifting, and flossing, because there is a difference, okay? Let's talk about a few different options for weight. Now, one thing to consider too is, as I mentioned before, anything you can bobber dog, you can drift fish. And this particular rod is set up, believe it or not, it has 2 presentations on here, okay? I have my main presentation, which I would put a little piece of bait on there, and that's gonna work great. And I also drag along this little tiny fly egg, single egg offering. That's about 18 or 20 inches behind my main offering. There's nothing wrong with fishing dual rigs. Fly guys have done it for years. Sometimes they fish 2 or 3 rigs. It all works. Sometimes when drift fishing, you can get away with that. If you can cast it and not get it tangled up, you can do a double offering. Some different options for weight. Now for me, there really is no other option. I'm going to fish stick leads all day long, but for some of you guys, you like to do different things, okay? And that's fine. One thing we can do is we can simply tie on to our barrel swivel a little extra piece or tag line, the piece on there. We take our pliers and we take our hollow core lead, and we're just going to cut a little piece off of here with the pliers that make it so you don't press or clamp shut that piece of hollow core. And we'll see if we can get this in here, if my eyes will work tonight. So one method is to simply put this little piece of line on here, and then I push through this piece of leader, okay? Now I have that on there, and all I have to do is crimp that on, okay? Now the thing about drift fishing is, more times than not, and with stick leads I don't really have to worry about it because typically they don't get hung up that much. So if you're not getting hung up, it's not an issue. If you're fishing weights that tend to get hung up, you want to have a release mechanism. Because drift fishing, your weight is contacting bottom. So by putting this on here with a hollow core and a little piece of line sticking off there, if that gets hung up, no big deal, because all you got to do is pull hard, and that's going to end up sliding off that line, and you can get your presentation back. So 1/8 inch hollow core with a piece of leader on there works great in that regard. All right. Some other options that we can talk about. Get back to my main drift fishing rod here. So I have a crane swivel on here, which is nothing more than a barrel swivel with a lock. Let me pull that out. So that's why these stick leads work so great, because they have an eye at each end and I can hang them in there. They're going to fish all day long. You seldom lose them. They work great. If I don't want to do that, back in the day, we used to take solid core lead with a piece of surgical tubing, and another way of doing this is simply to punch this through. See if I can do that, but probably not on that. There we go. On this swivel, now I put that piece of surgical tubing and I just simply press that lead into that surgical tubing. Now, when that gets hung up, okay, and that's pulling on there, more times than not, when that lead's in the rocks, it's just going to pop out. Now you reel that in, you haven't lost your leader and all your gear. You just simply cut off another piece and put that in. Works fantastic, has worked for years. I typically don't use the surgical tubing anymore because I've gone to stick leads. Another option, of course, is slinkies. You can build them yourself. You just take shot, you take a parachute cord and a lighter and some pliers, you put the shot in the cord, and you have yourself a slinky. These also work very well. They get hung up far less than solid lead does for whatever reason. They don't weigh as much. If you have a piece that's the same length as lead, it's not going to weigh as much, so you may have to run a longer piece, but that's nothing more than lead shot in the parachute cord, and you can simply, you know, work that through on your swivel and connect that too, and then that is also a mechanism for weighting. Of course, this won't pull out or release in any way, shape, or form, so if you get hung up, it's probably going to break. The other option is to take hollow core lead, okay? You can cut a piece off, much like these here, and you take your punch pliers. For a lot of you that don't know, that's what that punch is for, and you're just going to set that over here and squeeze it down and basically punch a hole in there. All right, so now, oops, missed it. Cut that off, do it again. So I'm going to punch that lead. Okay, so now I got a nice hole that I put in there. I usually like to pinch these a little thinner just so that I have that tearing point. That's what all these lead pieces are for and why they have holes in them, because you punch that lead. Now I'm going to hang that on the swivel, close that up. Now this one gets hung up. It actually works pretty well. That'll actually tear through that thin piece of that lead. It's a great way to do it. Again, I don't mess with any of this stuff. I pretty much just resolve to use my stick leads when it comes to drift fishing because they work so well. A 6-inch stick lead is going to weigh about 0.47 to 0.48, just under a ½ ounce. And you have sizes that vary from 5-inch down to 4, 3, and 2. Pretty much you can quick change them out because they have eyelets at each side. And they just give you a really nice natural drift. If you're drift fishing and haven't used the stick leads, give those a try because it's really going to up your game as far as sensation feel and how natural they match current speed. You can use any weighting system you want for your leads when drift fishing, but for me it's all about the stick lead. It's all about vibrant colors and presentation. Yarnies are a great go-to. Can't dismiss the fact how well bait works when presented drift fishing. And remember, at the end of your drift, always allow that presentation to sit, ever be so slightly, at the inside seam on the end of that drift and wait for those steelhead to come pick them up.